your experience in Gaza, I'm wondering if primarily was it first to do journalism, and were you at that time, based on what you were seeing, experiencing, able to anticipate this colossal level of violence that we're now seeing in 2024, starting 2023?
I was able to get into Gaza in 2014 at a time when the Israeli government press office, for whatever reason, was handing out press cards like candy. I walked in there, it was about to close. The lady who was in charge of the Russian desk just brought me in her office and just handed me a card. And the next day I was in Gaza. I was in Shujaiya. I saw the total destruction of that frontier border area east of Gaza City, which is a bastion of resistance, where the Israeli military had staged its initial ground incursion and then pulled back and blanketed the area with artillery because they were losing so many troops. It was a disaster for them. And I met family after family who had lost a dozen members here, 20 members here. Their house was completely destroyed. The stories I heard were horrifying. And it did prepare me for what Israel was going to do now, because I understood that they have a doctrine of not just targeting military targets, but entire areas. And what I saw was preparation for genocide. That's what you'll see in the film that I directed and wrote with Dan Cohen, Killing Gaza, the book I wrote about the war in Gaza in 2014, the 51-day war. And I also got to learn a lot that I didn't know in the West Bank. I'd spent a lot of time in the West Bank about Palestinian resistance, that the capacity of the resistance factions in Gaza had been vastly underestimated, and that the figures associated with the Al-Qassam brigades, like Abu Ubaidah, who is their voice, were these kind of folk heroes, Mohammed Deif, who were unknown in the Western world. And what they said carried so much weight among the Palestinian people that it extended beyond Hamas. So that also prepared me to understand October 7th and what was to come after, which was that these factions had prepared for a war in which they knew there was a massive power imbalance and that people would suffer massively, and that they had prepared for years of war. And I didn't believe that the Israeli public or the Israeli military intelligence leadership was prepared in the same way. Once you're there in Gaza and you can really experience what it's like during a war and be there under the bombs and see the society continue to function, for example, be able to order food during bombardments all around you, rocket salvos going off, and you get a guy in a motorcycle just calmly bring you your food, you see the steadfastness and resilience of a society that I don't think people who haven't been there can possibly understand.
Yes, and sometimes there's a disconnect, as you were alluding earlier, between the base and the brass of a power structure like the Democratic Party. I'm wondering, in your experience while you were there in Palestine, whether you saw there was that disconnect between Israeli society and Israeli leadership, or are they, or at least at that time, are they pretty much in alignment?
Well, my book Goliath was really my attempt to convey to Americans the reality of Jewish-Israeli society, which is not that there is a difference politically between the Israeli people and this psychotic right-wing leadership, but that the more right-wing, the more theocratic, the more genocidal the leadership becomes, the more reflective it is of the essence of Jewish-Israeli society under the system of Zionism at this stage. And I tried to immerse readers in the world that I existed in over the course of 5 years, going in and out of the heart of Jewish-Israeli society, and seeing the various systems of indoctrination that ensure this militarized mindset of children as soon as they are conscious, all the way through their military service, exploiting everything from the Holocaust to various intifadas to instill this culture of fear and loathing of Palestinians and the people on the other, not just on the other side of the wall, but the people who might share a classroom with them at Haifa University, and also to show what it was like for Palestinian citizens of Israel under that system. That's something that wasn't really spoken about. So this also made me believe that Israel was on its way toward committing genocide. What I took away from that project, writing the book Goliath, was that Israel's destiny, as expressed by a majority of its population, was to finish 1948. You know, you can be in Tel Aviv and meet some liberal Israelis or leftist Israelis who might have another vision, and I spent a lot of time with the very marginalized anti-Zionist Jewish Israelis who in many ways were my guides to Israel, but I also got to be on base with Israeli soldiers in the West Bank and talk to them. And they come from the communities that represent the true working class, Jewish Israeli working class, who are kind of ignored in their own ways and have faced their own level of violence from the Israeli police. And what they say simply is, you know, our lives are hard here. It would be a lot easier if someone could just push the button and eliminate the Palestinians. We don't care. That's where Ben-Gvir comes from. That's where Bezalel Smotrich comes from. That's where, in many ways, Netanyahu comes from that, but he balances that reality, the genocidal impulse that is emanated from the Zionist indoctrination system. He balances that with the Americans who he has to cater to and manipulate. And Netanyahu is such a special figure in that regard because, you know, throughout the 90s, he was mostly here in Washington, hanging out at AIPAC's offices right down on K Street. He grew up in suburban Philadelphia. His father spent most of his life in upstate New York. Netanyahu is as much a product of this society as he is of that, and he's the last figure who can balance those two interests. Once Netanyahu leaves the stage, it's going to be those guys on the military base, and Americans need to recognize that's the real Israel that they're going to have to contend with, which has nuclear power, which has the capacity to commit genocide, and is doing it right before our eyes and live streaming it shamelessly.
There's an interesting concept that you bring up on the Grayzone. I'd like to explore with you, called respectability politics, I think you call it. And I'm wondering if you can expound on that and perhaps connect it to the kind of investigative work you do, because as I was talking to Aaron Mate about it as well, I do wonder whether that politics has to be challenged or even undermined if there's any hope that journalism can actually mobilize people to join in solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Well, I think we've witnessed respectability politics vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue be substantially weakened within US media because of the exposure of so many of the lies that Israel spun out about October 7th atrocities. So you would have some of the journalists who knew the truth about occupation and apartheid, but who still wanted to maintain their cachet within, whether it's US academia, media, or politics, remain friendly with some progressive members of the Democratic Party. They would have to preface their condemnations of Israel with a condemnation of Hamas or a condemnation of Hamas mass rape or whatever they were said to have done after October 7th. And that's sort of fallen away after over 6 months of just unremitting live stream genocide. But on so many other issues, the people who still want to keep one foot in mainstream media and be the, to the left edge of conventional opinion, they're still going to virtue signal on their hatred of Russia or China or whatever official enemy there is, or their opposition to authoritarianism, in order to denounce what Israel's doing to the Palestinians. And what they're doing is they're reinforcing the same international system that has doomed the Palestinians to isolation, siege, and genocide. The same transatlantic system that uses liberalism as a mask for all the support that it provides to fascistic elements from Israel to Ukraine. And they, therefore, are actually making our job harder. So when we talk about respectability politics, it's about seeming respectable in the eyes of people who represent that system in order to get them to just give up on Israel. And they're not going to, you can't just give up on Israel and continue to support the rest of these imperial projects, Taiwan, Ukraine, regime change across Latin America from Cuba to Venezuela to Nicaragua. It's all, we see it at the Grayzone as all part of one system. So we're willing to be castigated by the New York Times and be portrayed as sort of enemy site that's possibly suspicious, possibly supported by the Kremlin and all these other enemy states. We're willing to take that hit in order to just be able to tell the truth about the wider transatlantic system that we see as the problem here. And I think most Americans are increasingly with us because it's not benefiting them.
Should the public be surprised that these so-called liberal, progressive media outlets are on board with things that, in terms of social justice, are important? For example, anti-racism movements or women's rights movements. But when it comes to Palestine, it's not. It's pro-Israel. Should they be surprised? Should they find that jarring? Or is there a logic that's unspoken that maybe you can shed some light on that's going on there?
Well, I, in some ways, respect an Itamar Ben-Gvir more than I respect someone who would have a "hate has no home here" sign on their front lawn or a "Black Lives Matter" sign who supports Israel. And those people exist in the US. I know them. I primarily know them because I'm Jewish. So I grew up around them. They're mostly of the baby boomer generation. And the hypocrisy is just too much to bear. That they want everyone to see them as good liberal people, but they support an ethno-supremacist, an officially ethno-supremacist state whose government is now the truest reflection of its political and ideological trajectory. And they can't square the contradiction. And when you confront them, when I would confront Itamar Ben-Gvir, he might be able to just sit right across from me and coldly distill the true logic of Zionism. But if I try to confront a 60 or 70 something Jewish liberal on the contradiction between their liberalism and their professed anti-racism and their support for Israel, they will melt down immediately and lose it on me and resort to absurd talking points. And that's really a generation that is falling away. I think that's one of the most refreshing things that we've seen in this era, and especially since October 7th, is that millennials and Gen Z, including within Jewish liberal homes, Jewish liberal communities, start to square that contradiction and acknowledge to themselves that Israel and Zionism is not something that they can be a part of. It's something that's separate from their identity. And at this point, really, when you look at the polls of who supports Israel within Jewish communities, it's more observant ones who are closer to the mindset of Ben-Gvir, the modern Orthodox, religious nationalist mindset, the people who might be fans of Ben Shapiro. So I think we're moving towards more truth culturally in this country. We're towards more honesty. I think that was a refreshing thing about the Trump era too, is to have a president who really says what he thinks, to lift the mask on American empire, to say, yeah, we've had some killers here too, haven't we? Yeah, we're going to Syria to take their oil and take their gas. We didn't get the oil from Iraq. That was the problem. That's what we're seeing across the West. And so the honesty exists at the top and the bottom. And I think right-wingers are starting to see it too, that there's a contradiction between being America first and supporting Israel and giving them $4 billion a year when what they're doing doesn't advance American interests. And they don't really think that their Christian soldiers should go and fight and die for the self-professed Jewish state. So it's been really refreshing to watch all these contradictions come to light.
One question I'm not sure that's been asked enough or at all, is how you think that those within the pro-Palestinian movement could also be allies to their Jewish brothers and sisters who are on the receiving end of these vicious attacks from people who, I don't have to mention the names that they're being called just for supporting Palestine, because that's also an attack on the solidarity movement too. And I think, just speaking for myself, we want to be there for our Jewish brothers and sisters when they're being attacked this way, for supporting Palestine. So any sort of insight into how we can play a role in standing alongside?
Well, I can speak to my own experience, and it's not just an experience as a Jew, it's an experience as someone who's not Palestinian. I think when someone is supporting, and let me just say, I'm not pro-Palestinian. It's not a football game. And I don't see Palestine as good and Israel as evil. I see Zionism as evil. And there is also evil. There are also some evil people within Palestinian society. Ask anybody who lives in Ramallah. So it's not so simple. But for me, being Jewish, being from Washington, being around some degree of power, it did take some deprogramming and an intense level of psychological and intellectual processing for me to arrive where I am. And I think people like that do deserve a certain level of credit from Palestinians who were born into it, but I'm not asking them for anything. I don't seek any reward from them. What I can say is the way that Palestinians have treated me over the years has been just with like overwhelming generosity. They automatically know how to show their graciousness to people who've supported their liberation, and I don't think I need to tell them what to do. I mean, it's one of the most hospitable societies I've ever been in. I think it's really up to Jews to pay the cost of leaving a community that's in a moral freefall. Whatever attacks you get as a Jew from your community or from these artificially constructed Jewish establishment organizations, which will attack you. Stop Anti-Semitism, for example, this site run by this racist Lior Reznichenko in Los Angeles, who's funded by Adam Milstein, who basically just doxes people, including Jewish people, paints them as terrorists. That is the price for saving your soul. And I think there's nothing better than being on the side of humanity.
Yes, exactly. Sort of what I'm getting at is because there's really not a lot of talk within the mainstream media about how those who are siding with Palestine or humanity very much care about fighting anti-Semitism. They very much care about fighting anti-Semitism, but it just gets sidelined because there's this constant equating of support of Israel as being non-anti-Semitic and opposition to Israel as being anti-Semitic. So I feel that somehow there needs maybe to be a narrative that a new narrative around that, or if it exists, one that gets further amplified about how this is, a universal struggle that includes the rights of Palestinians, the rights of Jews, the rights of all peoples.
Well, this is what every Jew who lives in the diaspora needs to understand, is that Zionism isn't here to protect them. It's actually here to imperil them by design. Zionism is designed to destabilize the Jewish diaspora in order to compel them to move to somewhere within the non-defined borders and militarized frontiers of Israel to be a part of its high-tech, Spartan, genocidal army and to help it wage demographic trench warfare against the Palestinians. It doesn't want us here. David Ben-Gurion spelled that out clearly in his memoirs. And when you emigrate to Israel, they say you're making aliyah, you're going up. When you leave, they say you're going down, you're descending into the diaspora. Zionism thrives off of anti-Semitism. Zionist organizations rely on anti-Semitism to pay their bills. Look at the Anti-Defamation League. Without anti-Semitism, which they constantly inflate to the point where over 50% of their documented anti-Semitic incidents since October 7th are simply pro-Palestine rallies, peace rallies, it's pretty obvious that they need anti-Semitism to exist. And so Israel is actually an engine of anti-Semitism through what it does. And it's a fact that, and I see it on social media, many people who are outraged at what Israel's doing are delving into anti-Semitic narratives where they conflate Zionism with all Jews, or they see something essential about Judaism and the Jewish religion as responsible for this. And this isn't actually about colonialism, imperialism. That's real. Yes. But it's flowing from the fact that Israel's massacring babies at an industrial scale. And if it would just stop doing that, and if this vast lobby that it's constructed across the diaspora would just stop destroying people's reputations, pointing the finger, and manufacturing anti-Semitism, it would all go away. And we Jews in the United States who've been living through this golden age, we just be like the Episcopalians. What's wrong with that? Well, they can't live with that. They can't just let us be. So I see Zionism as a kind of cult that is not only hostile to Muslims and Christians that live within its realm, but to Jews who live across the world and want to just be normal Jews here.
Yes, it's a really good point, well taken, because it kind of speaks to, as you're saying, the cultish nature of this movement. When you really see it in practice, it sounds so benign sometimes, like why would anyone object to a homeland? When you hear it described in certain terms, but
you can see the cult when you go to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And that's where bizarre cult members like the ostensibly Gentile Javier Milei of Argentina, former sex coach and libertarian anarchist, makes his pilgrimage, or any US presidential hopeful would make their pilgrimage by putting a message into a wall, weeping at the wall. Milei ugly cried at the wall. It was a bizarre scene. But if you stand back from the wall for a second, you'll see not only all of the trappings of militarism and occupation around you, but you'll see a giant candelabra marking the 6 million killed during the Holocaust, and a giant Israeli flag, which the ultra-Orthodox authorities who kind of manage the wall and will take you in to say the Shema and wrap tefillin inside the wall, they successfully lobbied to push that flag back a little bit, because they don't want that, but that's the cult. It's the cult of the Holocaust, the state of Israel, and some rendering of the Jewish religion all in one. And that's not my Judaism in the US. I always walk past the National Mall all the time, and I say, where is the American Jewish Museum? Everybody has there's that Museum of African American History. There's the Native American Museum. Native Americans suffered a real deal genocide. And you go in that museum, it's not all about genocide. It's about Native American culture, including today. Same with the African Americans. They suffered a genocide. The Middle Passage was like a genocidal project. They suffered through slavery. Their museum, the further you go up, you go through African American achievements. American Jews have achieved so much for this country. We've contributed so much in culture, science, learning, and we don't have one. What do we have? We have a Holocaust museum. And who's on the board? Who do they put on the trustees of the Holocaust Museum? War criminals like Elliot Abrams. That's the cult. It's the cult that Norman Finkelstein took apart in the Holocaust industry. And it is a cult of militarism, war, indoctrination, and it's responsible for the moral freefall that we're seeing within the Jewish establishment.
Thank you so much, Max, for this very thought-provoking and illuminating discussion. And I'm just wondering, before we wrap up, if you have any final thoughts or observations.
Well, I have very light eyes, so I'm not wearing these sunglasses for any reason other than I couldn't keep them open throughout this interview. So thanks for bearing with me.
Wonderful. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you, Max.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.